There's a factory in Richmond, Virginia that quietly produces nearly half of all cigarettes smoked in the United States. Every single day, machines inside this one location roll hundreds of millions of cigarettes, not spread across the country, not diversified. One factory, one city, one point of failure. And here's the strange part. This wasn't built for growth. It was built for decline. So why would one of the most powerful companies in American history bet its entire domestic business on a single factory, right as the industry was dying? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning. There's a rule every business student learns early. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. You diversify factories. You spread risk. You plan for disasters you hope never happen. Philip Morris did the opposite. By 2010, the company made a decision that shocked even industry insiders. They shut down their remaining cigarette plants across the U.S. and moved all domestic cigarette production into one place, Richmond, Virginia. From that point on, nearly every Marlboro, every Virginia Slims, every Benson & Hedges sold in the United States came from a single industrial complex on Commerce Road. No backup plant, no regional redundancy, no safety net. If Richmond stopped, America's cigarette supply stopped with it. At first glance, this looks reckless. What if there's a fire, a labor strike, a natural disaster, a major equipment failure? Any one of those could wipe out the entire domestic business overnight. But Philip Morris wasn't acting irrationally. They were acting realistically. Because by the late 2000s, the American cigarette market wasn't growing anymore. It was shrinking. Smoking rates were falling every year. Regulations were tightening. Taxes were rising. Public opinion had turned permanently hostile. This wasn't an industry preparing for expansion. It was an industry preparing for the end. And when a market is shrinking, resilience matters less than efficiency. Running multiple factories made sense when demand was booming. It made no sense when sales were slowly bleeding away. So Philip Morris made a cold, calculated decision. If cigarettes were going to die in America, they weren't going to die inefficiently. They would consolidate everything into one hyper-optimized facility, cut costs, eliminate redundancy, control quality, and extract as much profit as possible from a declining customer base. Richmond wasn't a growth strategy. It was a harvest strategy. And once that bet was placed, there was no going back. But to understand why Philip Morris was confident enough to make such a risky move, you have to understand the kind of company this was. Because this wasn't just any manufacturer. This was a company that had already pulled off one of the most audacious transformations in business history. And that story begins nearly 200 years earlier, in a crowded neighborhood in London that wasn't supposed to produce empires. The story of Philip Morris doesn't begin in boardrooms or factories. It begins in Whitechapel, London. In the early 1800s, Whitechapel was one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. Crowded tenements, narrow alleys, smoke, sewage, and desperation hanging in the air. This was where immigrants ended up when they had nothing else. And this is where a German immigrant family tried to survive by doing the one thing they knew how to do: sell tobacco. In 1847, a small tobacco shop opened its doors on Bond Street, run by the Morris family. At the time, it wasn't special. They didn't manufacture anything themselves. They sold products made by others. But the timing mattered. Cigarettes were starting to replace pipes and cigars. Smoking was becoming faster, more portable, more social. And Philip Morris saw the shift coming before most people did. By the 1850s, he made a critical move. He stopped being just a retailer. Philip Morris began manufacturing his own cigarettes, hand-rolled and targeted at wealthier customers, not mass market, not cheap, premium. That decision changed everything. By 1870, Philip Morris opened a shop at 108 New Bond Street, one of London's most prestigious retail districts. This wasn't just a better address, it was a declaration. The immigrant kid from Whitechapel had arrived. The business was growing. The brand was taking shape. Everything was finally working. And then, suddenly, it stopped. In 1873, Philip Morris died at just 37 years old. No succession plan, no corporate structure, no empire. Just a small but promising tobacco business that should have disappeared with him. Most companies did, especially in the 19th century. But Philip Morris didn't die, because his wife refused to let it. Victorian England was not a place where women ran businesses. That didn't stop Margaret Morris. After her husband's death, she took control of the company and brought Philip's brother into the operation. Not as a figurehead, as active leadership. They kept production running. They kept customers. They kept the brand alive. For decades. This period rarely gets attention, but it matters more than most people realize. Because Philip Morris, the man, never built the empire. He built the foundation. The empire was built by the people who came after him. By the turn of the 20th century, Philip Morris and Company was a legitimate player in the British tobacco market, respected, stable, profitable, and once again, timing mattered. Because the real opportunity wasn't in London anymore. It was across the Atlantic. In the early 1900s, Philip Morris expanded into the United States. At first, nothing revolutionary happened. They sold premium cigarettes to upper-class smokers. Steady business, no breakthroughs. Then, in 1924, the company made a decision that would later look ironic. They launched a new brand called Marlboro, and Marlboro was designed for women. At the time, female smoking was becoming socially acceptable, but only if it felt refined. Marlboro leaned into that. Soft packaging, gentle branding, feminine messaging. It worked, sort of. Sales were mediocre, not a failure, but not a hit. In the 1930s, Philip Morris tried to fix the problem with product innovation. They introduced the beauty tip filter, dyed red, so lipstick stains wouldn't show. Clever, still didn't work. By the late 1940s, Marlboro was barely registering in a booming cigarette market. Less than 1% market share. In an industry printing money, Marlboro was dying. Most companies would have killed the brand. Philip Morris didn't. Because they realized something. The problem wasn't the cigarette. It was the identity. By the early 1950s, the cigarette industry faced a new threat: health concerns. Reports linking smoking to lung cancer were beginning to circulate. Smokers were nervous. Filters suddenly mattered. But there was a problem. Filtered cigarettes were seen as weak, feminine, unmanly. Men didn't want them. That contradiction created an opening. If someone could make a filtered cigarette feel masculine, they wouldn't just survive the health scare, they would dominate it. Philip Morris bet everything on that idea. In 1954, they hired one of the most influential advertising minds in America and made a radical decision. They erased Marlboro's past. No women, no elegance, no softness. They weren't going to sell tobacco. They were going to sell an identity, and that identity would become one of the most powerful images in advertising history. Philip Morris didn't need better tobacco. They needed a miracle, and they found it in Chicago. The company hired Leo Burnett, an advertising executive who believed one thing above all else. People don't buy products. They buy who they want to be. Burnett looked at Marlboro and didn't see a failed women's cigarette. He saw a blank slate. The filtered cigarette already solved the health anxiety problem. The only thing missing was masculinity. So Burnett did something simple and brilliant. He stopped advertising cigarettes and started advertising men. The first Marlboro campaigns didn't feature one character. They featured several. A firefighter, a construction worker, a Navy sailor, and a cowboy. Each one represented strength, competence, and independence. Men who worked with their hands. Men who didn't explain themselves. There was one detail almost no one noticed consciously, but everyone felt. Every man had a tattoo on his hand. In the 1950s, tattoos weren't fashionable. They meant military service, manual labor, a life outside polite society. The message was clear. This wasn't a cigarette for office desks or cocktail parties. This was a cigarette for real men. Sales exploded. Within a year, Marlboro went from irrelevant to unavoidable. Nothing like it had ever happened in consumer marketing. But Burnett noticed something important. All the characters worked. One worked better than the rest, the cowboy. The cowboy wasn't just masculine, he was free. No boss, no city, no rules, just a man, a horse, and open land. In 1963, Philip Morris made the decision that locked Marlboro into history. They dropped every other image. From that point on, Marlboro meant one thing: the Marlboro Man. Once the Marlboro Man took over, there was no going back. By the late 1960s, Marlboro wasn't just growing, it was consuming the market. Smokers didn't switch brands for taste. They switched for identity. You didn't smoke Marlboro because it was smoother. You smoked Marlboro because it said something about who you were. By the early 1970s, Marlboro became the best-selling cigarette in the United States. Soon after, the world. Philip Morris had turned a dying product into the most powerful brand in tobacco history. And now they faced a new problem. They couldn't make cigarettes fast enough. In 1973, Philip Morris opened the Richmond Manufacturing Center in Virginia. This wasn't just a factory, it was a statement. 6 massive buildings. Over 1 million square feet of production space, designed to run 24 hours a day, every day. At full capacity, machines inside Richmond could roll hundreds of millions of cigarettes per day. Perfectly uniform, perfectly consistent. This was industrial tobacco at its absolute peak. The location wasn't random. Virginia had grown tobacco for centuries. The workforce understood the industry. Rail and highway access made nationwide distribution efficient. Richmond became the engine of Marlboro's dominance. If you bought a Marlboro anywhere in America, it likely came from here. And for a while, everything worked. The factory ran flawlessly. The brand ruled culture. Profits were enormous. Philip Morris wasn't just a cigarette company anymore. It was one of the most powerful corporations in the world. By the 1980s, Philip Morris was everywhere. They sponsored global sports. They put their branding into culture instead of commercials. And when advertising bans appeared, they went around them. At the same time, they diversified. Beer, food, household brands. On paper, Philip Morris looked invincible. But beneath the surface, the foundation was cracking. Health data was no longer ambiguous. Smoking killed people. Everyone knew it. And now, governments wanted compensation. For decades, Philip Morris had one legal strategy: deny, delay, outspend. It worked until the 1990s. States began suing to recover healthcare costs linked to smoking-related illness, not individuals, governments. In 1998, Philip Morris agreed to the Master Settlement Agreement, hundreds of billions of dollars over decades. It was the largest civil settlement in American history, but worse was coming. In 2006, a federal court ruled that Philip Morris had engaged in decades-long deception about smoking and addiction. The image they'd built for a century collapsed overnight. And yet, the factory in Richmond kept running. By the early 2000s, Philip Morris understood something most companies refused to accept. The American cigarette market was dying. Not suddenly, not dramatically, slowly. So the company stopped trying to save it. Instead, they optimized it. In 2008, Philip Morris split in two. One company focused on international growth. The other handled the shrinking U.S. market. Two futures. One passed. Then came the final decision. In 2010, Philip Morris shut down its remaining U.S. cigarette factories. All production moved to Richmond. One factory, one system, maximum efficiency. This wasn't about safety. It was about math. A shrinking market doesn't need redundancy. It needs profit extraction. Automation increased, labor decreased, costs dropped. Richmond became a fortress built not for expansion, but for endurance. As long as Americans kept smoking, Richmond would keep running. Smoking rates continue to fall. Every year, fewer Americans light up. But Marlboro still dominates what remains. Brand loyalty built decades earlier refuses to disappear. So the machines keep turning. Day after day, year after year. Richmond doesn't represent growth. It represents the final stage of an industry, a company that understood decline early enough to profit from it. Philip Morris began as a tiny shop in London. It became a global empire through marketing, identity, and scale. And now its legacy is a single factory producing a product the world is slowly leaving behind. The Marlboro man is gone. The ads are banned. The culture has moved on. But in Richmond, the machines still run, quietly manufacturing the last chapter of American tobacco, not with rebellion, not with freedom, but with ruthless efficiency.